Thank you very much. And look, it's a real pleasure for me to be here today to present the Foresight report that we've produced as a result of work over the last 9 or 10 months or so. And I suppose I could, do the 30-second thing, Chairman, but I am going to go on a little bit longer than that. I think, the simple message that I would like to give you about Foresight is that all the wonderful developments that Banning talked about this morning in his inspiring talk, they all have possibilities in the agri-food industry to help transform our industry over the coming decades. And I could walk away now, but I might want for another minute. So look, and I think Janet has given us some really good examples from the UK of where developments are happening in that country. So the outline of my presentation, I'm going to very, very quickly skim over the context for our Foresight exercise. And the same, I'll really just skim past the transformations that are needed in the agri-food sector. I want to get to the meat of it, which is the vision for 5 key technologies that we have identified or that we have categorised to transform the Irish food industry, and briefly to finish up with some thoughts and implementation. So look, megatrends, I'm going to, you're all familiar with the kind of big drivers of change that have been mentioned here this morning. We've food and nutrition security, obviously a huge opportunity. We see that here in this country, but the simple message is, while there is a huge opportunity in the production of more food, it cannot be on a business as usual basis given all the other challenges that are faced by the industry of climate change and pressure of natural resources, sustainable lifestyles and so on. So what kind of transformation is needed in the global agri-food system? And I'm going to quote Janet from the UK Food and Farming Foresight. To address the unprecedented challenges that lie ahead, the food system needs to change more radically in the coming decades than ever before, including during the industrial and green revolutions. And if you think of agriculture before the industrial and green revolutions compared to what it is today, we moved from horsepower to machine power. We now have fertilisers, we now have pesticide control agents, we have hybrid seeds and so on and so forth. That's a huge change in agriculture over that period, and think we have to make equal leaps or equal changes into things that we probably can't even think about today over the coming decades if we're going to meet these challenges. So it is a big challenge, and there's a whole lot of aspects that we must take into account in terms of how agri-food industry will develop to meet these challenges of food security and the other challenges mentioned. And we very often encapsulate the pathway for agriculture into this term of sustainable intensification. It's a bit of a buzzword now, but it really is what agriculture is going to have to do over the coming decades if it is going to try to meet these challenges. Here in Ireland, we've produced our plan for the industry. It has been referred to this morning already, so Foodwise 2025 sets out the vision for the industry, and sustainable intensification is at the heart of that. That's how we're going to produce our food and do it in a way that's going to allow us to meet our obligations to various treaties or to the society at large. So that's, I'm not going to go into that, but that's really at the heart of Foodwise is sustainable intensification. So moving on then, and we've heard from Banning and Janet about the wonderful developments in science and technology that are happening in many, many spheres. And I think Banning said that science and technology, they're crucial. They're not the only answer, they're not the whole answer to how the agri-food industry needs to develop, but they're central to it and it can't develop without them. So we see those as being critical, and we set out in this Foresight exercise to identify what are the key technologies that the agri-food industry, that Teagasc, that other research institutions, universities like UCC and UCD need to be aware of, what does the industry need to be aware of for the coming decades. And there's nothing that I'm mentioning there that hasn't been mentioned this morning, but I suppose what we then tried to do was try to stream them into various groupings. And we've come up with 5 groupings of technologies that we feel are going to be transformative for our agri-food industries in the coming decades. And I'm going to just 2 or 3 slides on each of those technologies. So the first is our plant and animal genomics and related technologies. And I suppose the key underpinning technology that has allowed us make advances in these has been low-cost genotyping and sequencing. And, Banning has referred to that already this morning. And we've already seen, as Aidan O'Driscoll mentioned, the application, a successful application of genomic technologies here in Ireland in terms of introducing genomic selection into our cattle breeding programme. And we were only the 2nd country in the world to do that after the US. So, there's already an example of a success in this area. The current state of the art, as I said, the widespread availability of low-cost genotyping is really what's driving this, and you can see the way the cost of genotyping has dropped even since we were doing the research to allow the dairy genomic selection to take place. We're now involved in a project that Aidan O'Driscoll mentioned this morning, the Beef Data and Genomics Programme, one of the biggest programs in the world, certainly one of the biggest publicly funded programs around genomics. We're in the process of sequencing 1 million animals from our cattle herd. And we're going to have, for each of those animals, we're going to have 50 million DNA variants. We're not actually measuring that number, we're imputing them, but there'll be 50 million DNA variants on each of those animals by 2017. Already we've seen, as Aidan mentioned, the genomic selection in dairying has given us a 50% increase in the rate of genetic gain. So you can see the possibilities that are happening here. On the crop side, it's exactly the same process. The technology is really moving on. What was state-of-the-art in 2012, 454 sequencing, if you had one of those, you were the god of sequencing. You know, old technology now. And now there's other newer technologies on the block. And already we can see, you know, the outputs of that in terms of we are using in our own potato breeding program, we're using a number of DNA markers for nematode resistance, and that allows us to identify the resistant varieties in our program a couple of years earlier than with just conventional testing of those potatoes. In terms of the future applications, we're going to see beef genomic selection available in this country in 2016, possibly sheep next year. But I think the next big step for genomic technologies in cattle breeding is going to be the introduction of new traits around animal health, around milk and meat quality, around feed intake, and around greenhouse gas emissions into our breeding programs. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, because one of the big things that we need to be able to do is phenotype our animals for those traits. So that's going to be critical, and that will link with one of the technologies that talk about in a minute, the digital technologies. We're seeing this huge growth in data. The dairy genomic selection that I mentioned, there were 1,000 bulls genotyped for that at 56K coverage each. We're now, as I mentioned, we're doing 1 million animals at 50 million SNPs each. So you can see in a short number of years the exponential growth in the data that's being applied in animal breeding. Huge job for ICBF there, obviously, in storing all that data just in the cloud. So that's the breeding side. We're going to see huge, I think, new developments in that. But as well as the breeding and genetics, you're going to see changes in management as a result of all this genomic information. So just as we see in humans now, and there's a company, a Californian company called 23andMe, you can send off a DNA sample to them. I think for maybe $100 or $200, they'll genotype you and give you back your genotype, and then you can adjust your diet or your health accordingly. You know what you're at risk of. We'll see exactly the same type of personalised animal management emerging, I think, over the coming decades in our livestock industries. So what we'll get as a result is better overall and better balanced management through a combination of genetics and management of our animals. On crops, we're currently researching the introduction of genomic selection into our grass breeding program. We're not the only country in the world doing that. Denmark and New Zealand are also working hard on this. And what I think you're going to see is that the technologies, genome sequencing, which will continue to get cheaper, but also the new gene editing technologies that have been mentioned, they're going to allow us to speed up the breeding of our crops. And they're, again, the kind of big step is going to be the introduction of novel traits such as disease resistance or nitrogen use efficiency into our breeding programs in a way that we're currently not able to breed for those difficult to breed for traits. The second technology area is the microbiota, and that's, you know, the microbiota, it's the totality or the community of microbes that are present in a particular organism or place or environment. So we hear the human microbiota or the gut microbiota or the soil microbiota referred to. And again, the big underlying technology here is next generation sequencing. If you were previously talking to people studying the microbiota, they were trying to culture some of the organisms that might be in your gut, and they could culture maybe a fraction of them, maybe 1% of them is all they could actually grow in a laboratory. Now we can study the whole community using next generation sequencing. The current state of the art in this is that there's very strong evidence that our microbiota influences our physical and mental health and development. You know, in particular, our gut microbiota, that's where a lot of the work we've been involved in has been around. The big then next step which is the opportunity for the food industry, is that that gut microbiota can be influenced by the food that you eat and how you eat it. So that's an exciting opportunity for the food industry, I think, to capitalise on that relationship. And I think the other exciting possibility for agriculture is going to be to apply the same thinking and the same technologies to some of the other microbiota that are important in agriculture. So the animal gut microbiota, the soil microbiota, and the plant microbiota. Stuck there, if our technician could just move me on. Okay, there we are. So over the next 20 years, I think we're going to see the emergence from this area of foods, a plethora of foods to promote health. We'll see enhanced agricultural efficiency, we'll see reduced emissions from our animals, and we'll see better soil quality. The third technology area is digital technologies, and we've referred to these a good bit already this morning. There are a suite of technologies involving those base technologies. And this is the conceptual framework I use to try to fit them together or see where the various bits fit. And there's various steps along the way to the application of these digital technologies, going from measuring something, then capturing that data, integrating that data with other data, analysing the data to make some useful information out of it, and finally delivering some information back to the user so that he or she can make a decision based on that information. There's no point just capturing information if it doesn't impact on a decision. So these are just some of the examples of the type of data that we are and will be collecting. This is some data that we're using, satellite data or remote sensing, that we're using to estimate the amount of grass in fields at the field scale, and we're currently using data from NASA in relation to that. There's actually been a game changer in relation to availability of this type of data because the EU's new Sentinel-2 satellite, that's going to give us resolution down to tens of meters as opposed to hundreds of meters with the previous NASA data we were working with. So you can see we're collecting more and more data. And the other big game changer with this is this data from Sentinel-2 is guaranteed to be available free to users for the next 20 years. So, you know, for people working in this area, there's that certainty around the data. So in terms of our 5 steps, you know, we're measuring and we're capturing that data. On the animal side, there's a plethora of technologies that are available, or sensors for capturing information on animals. I'm not going to go through them all, but you know, there's various wearable, there's various internal, there's pen side type sensors, there's image analysis. So a whole load of ways that we can use to measure things on animals. And there's going to be, you know, an explosion of new ones around that area. And some of those are obviously also involved in capturing that information and putting it up into the cloud. But how do we actually make use of all that, you know, satellite data or all those sensors in animals? How do we actually go down to a farmer and say, right, we're going to help you on your farm using some of these digital technologies? Well, this is one area that we're involved in already. You know, we're helping farmers, I suppose, to manage that pasture. Try to do it as precisely as if those cows were inside in a feedlot and we could accurately weigh to 10 grams or 100 grams what they were being fed every day. We want to manage the pasture to the same level of precision. And we have developed, in conjunction with a company, True North Mapping, a way to take the data measurement instrument that we use, that plate meter, to capture the data from that through a mobile phone app into a database that we've developed called Pasture Base. And that then gives back out to the farmer the decision as to where to put the fence. So it actually shows him on his mobile phone where to put the fence in the field for the next day's allocation of grazing. So we're actually turning some of that data into information to help make a decision. We want to go further than that. We want to get down to the level of being able to predict the amount of growth that will happen in that paddock for the next, you know, week to 2 weeks. And we will use that we will do that by combining what we know, what we measure to be there, with localized weather data and grass growth prediction models to predict, well, what will actually be there in 2 weeks' time if he comes back there in 2 weeks' time. So again, it's helping the farmer to make decisions about the management of that paddock. The tillage farm of the future, again, you know, we've loads and loads of ways to capture data on our tillage farms. I'm not going to go through them. But again, the challenge is actually to turn that data into useful applications for our farmers. So the future impacts of these digital technologies, we're going to have decisions that will be informed or more informed by information rather than blueprints, or rather than hunches, or rather than farmers' best judgment. So we'll hopefully get better decisions. We'll have greater control and precision around the things that go on in our farms. We'll have better use of labour. And very importantly, we'll have evidence for consumers and regulators about what's going on in the farm, so that people can look back and see where and how their food was produced. The fourth area is new technologies for food processing. And there's a range of these that I'm not going to go into. They'll probably be covered later in the day. They include some of the ones we've mentioned earlier, including 3D printing of food and so on, new thermal technologies and extraction technologies. And they're going to develop, new, and they're going to be applied. But I think there's a couple of trends that are very important that we keep in mind when we're seeing how these technologies might be developed. First of all, the food industry, it's moving over the last number of years and will continue to move from a provider of food and beverage to a provider of nutrition and health. And that's the space the food industry wants to occupy. So we must view all these technologies through that lens. Secondly, we're moving into an era of zero waste. Food companies no longer want to develop a brilliant new product. It is a whole load of byproducts that they can't use from that new product. So every product that's developed, you must look at the consequences for the byproducts. And thirdly, certainly here in this part of the world, there's a view, the consumers have a very, very keen interest in how their food is produced. And one of the ways that they think food is better is when it's minimally processed. So whatever technologies we might want to develop, we have to look at it through the lens of the consumer, who's going to be a little bit maybe wary of over-processed foods. So anyway, some of the developments we're going to see are the trends that will continue. We're going to continue to see reductions in things like salt and sugar and fat levels as we try to make foods healthier. I think we're going to see very much a growing trend towards life stage nutrition. So whether it's for infants or expectant mothers, or whether it's for people that might have cognitive difficulties and we want a diet that might help them or whatever. We're going to see, I think, a lot of developments in that area. And we're still going to want to enjoy food. Food is primarily a pleasurable experience when we eat it. So the whole science of sensory science and the combination of that and what we know about the chemistry of sensory science with the chemistry or the consumer science is going to be a very important area for the food industry. And food quality and safety, that's always with us and always will be. And the new technologies are going to help us in terms of how we deal with food quality and in particular food safety. So the last area of our 5 technology streams is transformation in the food value chain system. And by that, this is, for me as a kind of as a scientist, this is the one that I sometimes struggle a bit with because I'm outside my comfort zone. But what we're talking about here is changes in scale and changes in specialization. And we've had some of those, some really good examples. This is totally by accident, but 2 of the things you mentioned, Banning, in your talk were Uber, and Halo is another example of how the whole business of running taxi firms has changed. We've seen the whole business of running hotels has changed, not through any new technology. There's no new technology putting up hotel rooms around the cities. It's just a new way of accessing space in cities, a new way of accessing taxis. So that's what we mean by transformation in the value chain, and in particular here, the food value chain we're interested in. And we already see a number of transformative happenings in our food value chains. In terms of at the primary production level, we're seeing milk quota removal having a big impact really on how farming is conducted here in Ireland. We're seeing some moves towards alternative models of land use and management. I think, the area of collaborative farming, leasing of land, they're certainly developing there, and anyone who's in the land rental business would tell you that, it has changed dramatically in the last year or 2 with dairy farmers now having a greater demand for land and maybe, making it very difficult for other farmers to access land. In terms of processing, we're going to see continued change in the process mix, and we will probably see some growth in the scale of operation. By that I mean the size of the plants. So we already see some of the big dryers that have been built here in Ireland for our dairy industry. We have some very big beef processing plants. Are they going to get bigger? Probably, but maybe they won't get too much bigger. Are we going to see differences in the scale of business, or will we see consolidation? We've quite a fragmented dairy industry. On the beef side, we've got three big players. So that's already quite consolidated. Will we see more consolidation in the scale of business? Will we see more integration in the way those businesses operate? And on the food service and distribution and retail side, the preferences of consumers, are going to become more powerful in the whole in the whole production cycle, and that's going to drive change right back to producers, because they're going to know, they're going to look for the evidence, they're going to look for the information on how their food was produced, and then they're going to want to influence that. Likewise, the personalised information that is available from genotyping, or that is available from knowing consumers' preference, that will lead to a whole suite of personalised data-driven services that are made available to consumers. And our food industry and our agri-industry has to be aware and ready for those type of changes that will happen. The circular bioeconomy, and by that we mean that a byproduct from one industry becomes the raw material for another. So we have no waste really in this economy. That will spawn a whole series of new value chains over the coming years. In the interest of time, I'm just going to pass past those. But the outcomes of all this, and I've gone through the 5 technology areas, or the groupings that we have put the technologies into. What difference will it make? That's, I guess, the next question. So these are some of the areas that we feel those technologies have the potential to make an impact. We're going to see improved production efficiency on our farms and in our food companies. We're going to be better able to protect natural capital, to reduce wastage, and to meet changing consumer demand. We'll be better able to tackle the challenge of climate change. We'll have more options available to us with that. We'll be in a far stronger position to demonstrate our compliance with legal obligations, whether that's at a farm level or whether it's at a country level. And also, we'll have the data and the proof to reinforce our position as a clean, green producer. We will see the development of new high-value food ingredients and food products. In terms of human health, we'll be able to ameliorate the disease risk, not just from consumption of contaminated food products, but from the type of nutrients that are in our food, so heart and cardiovascular issues and diabetes and so on. The reduction of allergies, of food intolerance, and we'll all probably, as we get on, this one will become more important, the delaying of the ageing process. Excuse the spelling typo there. We'll all be interested in that one, I think, as time goes on. A huge issue for society is antimicrobial resistance and the role of agriculture in that. We'll be better able to combat that. And we'll also hopefully be able to deal with the loss of control agents against cross-pests and diseases, which is a huge challenge for our crop sector going forward. And finally, we'll see the completion of this dynamic circular bioeconomy. So that's the vision. That's what we think. We think that these technologies, as Banning has much better outlined than me, and as Janet has outlined what's happening in the UK, they're going to be really important for the future. I think here in Ireland, we have to make sure we don't get left behind in our agriculture and food industry, that we're at the forefront of the application of those technologies so that we can gain, or our agriculture and food industry can gain competitive advantage in relation to those. So what are we going to need to do? And just a few very brief thoughts on this. There's obviously a lot will have to happen over the coming months and years. But I think the key thing that we realise in Teagasc, and the people that were with us in terms of the Foresight exercise, we cannot do this. This is not a job for Teagasc. It's far bigger than what we can do. So the key thing that we can do really here as an organisation charged with science and technology needs of the agriculture and food industry is to build the partnerships that are going to be needed to deliver on this potential that's there. And I think one of the, for me, one of the really exciting developments in my role in Teagasc over the last couple of years has been the emergence already of some of those partnerships. So we're working with the likes of Kieran Drain and the Tyndall. I wouldn't have known where the Tyndall was until recently. We're working with, Janet, you mentioned Willie Donnelly and the TSSG group in Waterford. That's all around internet connectivity and so on, and the Insight data analytical group in UCD. So, we're certainly already seeing new partnerships emerging out of this process, and they're going to be essential as we go forward. And I think it's really important to remember at the same time that the partnerships we already have are still going to be probably the critical ones. So in the whole area of genomics and animal breeding, like ICBF are one of the most successful breeding organisations in the world, and we work very closely with them. And that partnership is going to be central really to delivering a lot of the things we talked about here on the animal breeding side. And the partnerships we have with UCD and UCC in terms of agriculture and food science, they're not going to become redundant. They're going to become more important, I would see, in the future. So building those partnerships, creating implementation platforms around each of the technology areas. We're going to have to not just sit back and wait for this to happen, we're going to have to try and make this happen. I think a key role Teagasc can play, along with probably more so than the partners we might bring in from the digital industries, is we can ensure that whatever services might be designed for farmers are affordable and easily adopted. And I think, Janet, you mentioned this very much in your presentation as well, that farming and the food industry, it's a low margin business. So technologies, they have to have a low cost and have to be easily adopted if they're going to get widespread application. And one of the areas I guess where we see a role for us is in the establishment of a national digital farming testbed. And by that I mean a kind of a playpen for digital companies. And what we can bring to the table is we have lots of data that we can maybe make available to companies like that to see, well, does your sensor work? Does it actually predict what you think it will predict or measure what you want to measure? So that idea of I suppose, creating synergies from the type of information that we have and that others might like access to in the development of new technologies, I think is something that could be very important. Internally, Teagasc, we need to change ourselves. We will need to sit down after today. We'll establish an implementation team around this Foresight exercise. We will need to ensure that those technology areas are embedded in our research and knowledge transfer programs. And that doesn't mean we're going to be kicking out all the other disciplines we have in our programs. These will augment rather than replace the existing technologies and expertise and disciplines that we have in our programs. A big area, and again it has been mentioned earlier, is the ability or the ease with which farmers will adopt new technology. So there's a huge need in Ireland, as in any other country, to invest in skills and training of our farmers and food company operators, and to ensure that they are in a position to adopt these technologies, to understand them, to be able to deploy them to greatest effect. So this year we're kicking off a major review of our education and training programs, and this will be one of the aspects of that. And finally, we will obviously need to fill gaps in our staff and expertise, and I've listed a number of areas there. We'll certainly be looking to do some of this by partnership, but there are other skills that we are going to need if we're going to be able to participate and in this area in the coming years. So to conclude, in my view, and I think the view of everyone who has been involved in the Foresight process over the last number of months, there's a huge opportunity through the groups of technologies that we've outlined there to improve the efficiency, the profitability and the sustainability of our agriculture and food industry here in Ireland. We're very well positioned. We have great expertise in the agriculture and food sciences and technologies, and we have great food companies and that. And we have, I think, 8 of the 10 biggest ICT companies in the world are located here. So, we're very well positioned. But we needn't think that others will stand back and kind of, allow us to plod along. We see, the progress that's been made in the UK. We really have to, make sure it happens for us here in Ireland and not stand back and wait for others to do it for us. So I think, what we should aim to have and a goal at we set 2035 as a long-term vision for us, but we should be looking to ensure that our agriculture and food industries are the most technology-driven industries in the world. We would think, one of the most sustainable platforms for production of food in the world, one of the lowest cost platforms for pasture-based milk and meat, but we should look to add another platform to that, which is the application of technologies in how we go about doing our business of agriculture and food production. So I leave it at that, Chairman. Gormila Magwif.